the ghosts of a country still struggling to decide whether the law belongs to those who can pay for it or the ones who are crushed under it. So if you like your movies neat, safe, and comfortable, this one might actually sit in your chest like a weight for days after the credits roll, refusing to move, refusing to let you forget the look in a victim's eyes or the sick twist of a smirk that never really turns into an apology. It is not an easy watch, but it is a powerfully necessary one. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments. Pengacara Papan Atas drops into Indonesian cinema at a very interesting moment, because by 2025, the industry has already dipped its toes into social commentary, #Me Too narratives, and stories about systemic corruption. But what this film does is a little different. It doesn't just point at powerful men and say, they are bad. It turns around and stares straight at the celebrated legal heroes who help them walk out of court free, then at the audience that cheers those heroes on, and that might sound heavy-handed when you summarize it, but the film approaches it with this slow, simmering restraint, like it knows exactly how messy real trials are, how complicated motives are, and it trusts you enough to sit through long, tense conversations without big musical cues telling you what to feel, and that's part of what makes it feel so adult, in the best sense of the word. Set in Jakarta, the film opens not with a crime or a courtroom, but with silence. Early morning, the city half awake, sky stained grey-blue, a drone shot slowly gliding over office towers and cramped alleys before gliding toward a single glass tower, a law firm perched at the top, as if physically elevated above everything else, and inside that tower, in a glass-walled office where the dawn light hasn't quite decided whether it's soft or harsh, sits Zesan, the man whispered about across the legal world as Pengacara Papan Atas, the top-shelf lawyer, the undefeated one, the guy you call when you have money, power, and a problem big enough to topple a career, because he's known for making those problems vanish, and the movie doesn't introduce him with swagger, it introduces him with a pause, a close-up on his face as he stares at a wall covered with neat rows of framed newspaper clippings and court verdicts, his own victories turned into decoration, and for a second, the camera just lingers, and you can see the question in his eyes: when did these become trophies, and when did they become a kind of prison? The film is directed by an imaginary but very believable auteur, let's say Damar Prasetyo, who's clearly studied both classic Hollywood courtroom dramas and the grittier Asian social thrillers of the last decade, and he blends them into something that feels both familiar and distinctly Indonesian: the humid atmosphere, the oppressive bureaucracy, the white shirts sticking to sweating backs in overcrowded corridors, the small courtesies and casual corruption that are just part of the air people breathe. It's all there, but what stands at the center is always this triangle between Zesan, his new client Sanzu, and the shadows of the women whose lives have been shattered by men like them. The setup is deceptively simple. Zesan, an undefeated star lawyer with a ruthless reputation, is appointed, crucially, not just hired with a suitcase of cash but politically nudged and cornered, into defending Sanzu, the only son of Dano, a wealthy, old-guard businessman whose influence spills quietly through the halls of power in Jakarta, from police stations to parliament corridors. Sanzu has been convicted in the court of media and public opinion for rape, a high-profile case involving a young university student who dared to speak out and whose video testimony has gone viral, turning the case into a national conversation about consent, class, and the way powerful families muzzle victims behind NDAs and settlements. When we first meet Sanzu, he's not behind bars in an orange jumpsuit looking humbled. He's in a polished private detention wing, in a crisp white shirt, lounging on a sofa like he's in a waiting room before a flight, smoking an expensive cigarette, making jokes with a guard who, for the right money, laughs a little too easily, and everything about him screams entitlement: the casual way he interrupts people, the way his eyes slide over the female social worker in the room as if she's furniture, the way he rolls his tongue over his teeth before he speaks, like he's chewing on words and people alike. Opposite him, Dano sits in silence, a man with old money and old sins, eyes heavy, posture stiff, and the tension between father and son is thicker than the smoke. You can sense, right away, that Dano is less concerned about guilt or innocence than about legacy, about his family name becoming a hashtag on social media, about the doors that might quietly close to him after this, and he is the one who decides, they will get Zesan, the undefeated lawyer, to fix this. The first time Zesan and Sanzu meet, the film plays it as a clash of illusions. Sanzu clearly expects some slick, grinning showman who will high-five him and say, "Don't worry, I've got this," but instead he gets this very controlled, almost ascetic man in a perfectly cut black suit, eyes that seem to have seen too much and trust too little, and a way of speaking that's simultaneously polite and surgical. He doesn't waste words. He doesn't comfort. He doesn't even look at Sun Tzu much at first. He just looks at the file, at the evidence, and says things like, "The narrative is already against you, and even if the facts are disputed, perception is strong." And what's so arresting about this early stretch of the film is how it chooses to show us Sesson's brilliance not through big, "Objection, Your Honor," courtroom fireworks, but through the way he dissects a situation, how he rehearses angles in his head, how he plays out the chessboard 3, 4, 5 moves ahead, sometimes talking quietly into a recorder while jogging at dawn along a nearly empty Jakarta riverbank. But there's another thread woven in almost immediately, and this is where the film really sharpens its teeth. While the legal machinery is cranking up, while Dano is calling in favors and journalists are buzzing outside the courthouse, we cut to a completely different location, a small, warmly lit restaurant tucked in a crowded street, the kind of place where the owner knows most of the customers by name, and in a corner booth sits Kinaya, the pregnant wife of Haro, gently practicing some breathing exercises she learned in a prenatal class between bites of her food, occasionally chuckling at a video Haro sent her, because he's stuck late at work but texting her jokes to make up for it. Kinaya is all softness and strength combined. She's a former journalist who quit the grind after too many traumatic stories and is trying to build a quieter life, but you can see in the way she observes people, in the notebook she still carries, that her journalist instincts never really left. The restaurant scene at first feels like it belongs to some other movie, a softer domestic drama, until a group of young men walk in with loud laughter and expensive watches, and among them is Sun Tzu, pre-trial, still free on some technicality or still under house arrest, that apparently includes fancy dinners, and the air in the room changes. The camera shifts into Kinaya's point of view. We see Sun Tzu in fragments, his ring tapping on the table, his laugh cutting through the restaurant like a blade, his eyes scanning the room not to enjoy the place but to assess it, to own it. For a few minutes, they exist in parallel lines, Sun Tzu boasting to his friends about his crazy ex, they joke about the witch hunt online, while Kinaya scrolls news on her phone and pauses on an article about the very same rape case, face tightening, hand unconsciously resting on her belly. Then it happens, a spill, a bump, something tiny and mundane. A waiter accidentally brushes against Sun Tzu's table, some sauce lands near him, he explodes with this performative outrage, and Kinaya, watching this, can't help but look, just 1 second too long, with that mix of disbelief and disgust only someone who's covered too many stories of abuse can have, and Sun Tzu catches her gaze. It's a chilling moment, because you see the shift, the lazy arrogance in his expression hardens into something more predatory. He gets up, he walks over, and what follows is one of the film's most uncomfortable scenes, not because of graphic content, it keeps everything verbally suggestive and psychologically sharp, but because it's so horribly familiar, a man with social power and physical presence leaning too close to a woman in a public place, using jokes as weapons, comments about her body masked as flattery, questions about her husband just a shade too invasive, and it's all staged as this slow tightening of the frame around Kinaya's face as she tries to stay calm, tries to remember every article she's written about not provoking, not escalating, choosing her words carefully, because she's alone, because she's pregnant, because she doesn't know how far this stranger might go. Sun Tzu doesn't recognize her, of course. To him she's just another woman having dinner, another possible target for a little fun, another opportunity to assert power, and the film doesn't let us look away from how systematic that behavior is. Haro arrives late to the scene, walking into the restaurant with flowers, excited, only to find his wife shaken, her food cold, and a group of laughing men leaving. He doesn't see the worst of it, he just sees a fragment, a lingering look, a half-smirk from Sun Tzu as he brushes past, but he knows, instinctively, that something wrong happened. That's one of the great strengths of Pengacara Papan Atas. It often shows us just enough of an incident to let our imagination complete the horror, because by 2025, we know these dynamics, we've seen them in the news, in our own social circles, and the film trusts that you don't need the violence itself on screen to feel the dread. This chance encounter, of course, isn't really chance, the script is far too precise for that. Kinaya will turn out to be connected to the larger narrative in ways she doesn't realize yet, and Haro will be pulled into a moral crisis that echoes Sesson's, but the film holds that off for a while, letting the threads run in parallel. On one side, Sesson building a defense for a man who fits every stereotype of the unrepentant rich kid, on the other, Kinaya and Harrow grappling with the everyday, ground-level terror of encountering someone like that and trying to decide whether to speak up or just move on. Early on, the movie makes an important choice about how it reveals the crime at the center of the plot. We don't see it in real time, instead, we experience it through testimony, through the overlapping, sometimes contradictory accounts of witnesses, and through the viral video of the victim, a young woman named Lila, speaking directly into her phone, eyes red from crying, voice shaking but determined as she describes what happened to her in a hotel room after a party, how she said no, how they laughed, how she was made to feel like she'd asked for it. The video is shot vertically, of course, framed clumsily, with poor lighting, but on the big cinema screen, it becomes overwhelmingly powerful because the director lets it play in near silence, diegetic audio only, no swelling music, no cuts, it's just her, raw, and you can feel the audience in the theater collectively holding its breath. This is what Zessen is up against, at least officially, not just the legal case, but the moral verdict of the public, because Lila's video has turned into a symbol, and every talk show host, every hashtag, every protest outside the courthouse has latched onto it. At first, you might think this is going to be the story of a brilliant lawyer poking holes in her account and making you question her sincerity, like some dark, cynical puzzle box, but the film, to its credit, never really steers into, is she lying, territory. Instead, it asks a much more uncomfortable question: what does it mean when someone like Zessen uses all his legal skill, all his intelligence, not to find the truth but to construct enough doubt to let a man like Sanzu walk free? The big twist, or the emotional hinge of the film, is foreshadowed in small ways, the way Zessen flinches, just slightly, when he first sees Lila's video, as if it awakens some memory, the way his hand hesitates for a second when Dano mentions a certain street name, the way he stares a beat too long at a photo of Tsunzu as a teenager in the case file. We don't understand at first, but the film is already drip-feeding us clues that this isn't just any client for him. It isn't until that pivotal courtroom scene, one of those classic, everyone is present, the tension is unbearable, moments, that the connection is slammed into the open. The first time Tsunzu sees Zessen stand in court, fully, not as some guy behind a table but as the towering, composed figure commanding the attention of the entire room, there's this flicker of recognition across his face, the camera pushes in, and we're suddenly in Tsunzu's memory, younger, wilder, high on adrenaline and privilege, standing over a blooded teenager in a parking lot years earlier, a group of college boys laughing, a fight gone too far, a body slumped near a motorbike, a frantic young man screaming his brother's name, Zessen's brother, and there, stepping between them, a younger version of Tsunzu with that same cocky tilt of the head, saying something that might as well be, "What are you going to do? No one will believe you." It is implied, not stated explicitly, that some incident from years ago, an assault or a hit-and-run, ended in tragedy for someone close to Zessen, maybe a younger brother, maybe a friend, and that Dano's money made it quietly disappear. The case never reached court, the police reports went missing, and Zessen, then a law student with too little power, had to swallow the bitter fact that the law he was studying could be bent so easily. That was the crucible that forged him into the Pengacara Papan actors we see now, someone who decided that if the game was rigged, he might as well be the best player. The film doesn't spell every detail out in exposition, it trusts you to connect the dots from flashed images, strained silences, and the way Tsunzu's smug face drains of color when the past and present collide in that courtroom. From that moment on, the central moral question is on fire: how do you defend a man who destroyed your life, not metaphorically but literally, and how far will you go in the name of professionalism, in the name of some twisted idea of, "I'm just doing my job"? Watching Zessen try to navigate this is where the movie really sinks its hooks in. He tries, at first, to be the professional he has always been. He tells his team, personal feelings are irrelevant, he repeats the mantra that, everyone deserves a defense, he throws himself into case files, reconstructing timelines, poking at inconsistencies in witness statements, and he does it with this haunted intensity, as if he believes that if he can just treat this like any other case, he'll somehow outrun the storm building inside him. But the film is ruthless about showing the cracks. He starts waking up at 3 a.m., drenched in sweat, seeing his brother's face superimposed on Lila's. He watches videos of assault survivors testifying in other countries, as if he's trying to convince himself that his work is part of some larger system, not just a tool for the powerful. He attends a family gathering and catches his own mother watching the news about the case, recognition flickering in her eyes when she sees Tsunzu on screen, and the way she looks at her son afterward is a mix of pride, fear, and something bordering on accusation. What complicates things further is that Zessen isn't just dealing with his personal history, he's also surrounded by a legal ecosystem that feeds off cases like this. His junior associates, some of them idealistic, some of them hungry for fame, treat the case like a career-making opportunity. The media consultants hired by Darno's team start crafting narratives about boys being boys, about drunken misunderstandings, about the dangers of trial by social media, and they try to loop Zessen into their spin machine. When he resists certain angles, not wanting to smear Lila's reputation beyond what's legally required, they look at him like he's being naive, like he's forgotten what side he's on. And then there's Darno. Oh, Darno is a fascinating character. He's not the cartoonish villain you might expect. He's a weary man who's been bending reality with money for so long that he no longer sees it as bending. To him, this is just how things are done. There's a chilling scene where he and Zessen share a drink on a balcony after a long day in court. The city lights spread out below them, and Darno talks about his own youth, about mistakes he made, about his son growing up in a world where everything was always cleaned up for him, and he almost sounds like he understands that he helped create the monster sitting in that courtroom. But then he says, very quietly, "You're not here to judge him. You're here to save him," and the words hang in the air like a verdict of their own. Meanwhile, Tsunzu doesn't just sit passively in the background. The film makes the bold choice of giving us moments from his perspective too, not to humanize him in a redemptive way, but to show how someone like him rationalizes everything. In private, with his friends, he complains about being a victim of hysteria, he mocks protesters outside the court, he calls Lila names that the film doesn't even bother subtitling because the disgust in his tone is enough. But there are also fleeting flashes of something else, panic when he realizes Zessen recognizes him from the past, fear when he imagines actual jail time for the first time in his life, a strange longing when he watches videos of himself as a happy child on his father's phone. The film suggests, without ever excusing him, that he is both the architect of his own cruelty and the product of an ecosystem that never forced him to grow up. And then there's Haro and Kinaya, or, as I like to think of them, the mirror couple to Zessen's internal struggle. Haro is an ordinary guy, a mid-level bank employee, not rich, not connected, just trying to build a safe little world for his growing family. After the incident at the restaurant, he can't let it go. He starts seeing Tsunzu's face in every news segment about the rape case. He replays that tiny, ugly interaction in his head, thinking of the way Kinaya's voice trembled when she told him what happened, and he's torn between rage and helplessness. How do you stand up to someone like that? Do you file a report and watch it get buried? Do you confront him and risk violence? Do you just move on and focus on your unborn child, telling yourself that's more important? Kinaya, on the other hand, is trying to be the rational one. She knows how these stories go, she's written them, edited them, watched them disappear beneath the next scandal. She wants to protect her baby, protect Haro from doing something reckless, but her own sense of justice, of solidarity with other survivors, keeps gnawing at her. The film gives them long, quiet scenes at home, folding baby clothes, scrolling through news on their phones, debating whether to comment under Lila's video or to stay silent, and these scenes are the heart of the movie's emotional realism. Not everyone can stand up in court. Most people's relationship to injustice is exactly this, watching something horrific happen to someone else and wrestling with the question of whether adding your voice will make a difference or just put a target on your back. Gradually, the threads converge. Kinaya, scrolling late at night, stumbles across a deep dive article about the case, and there, in a photo of the defense team, she sees Zessen's face. Something about it rings a bell. Later, in a news segment, she sees old footage from a decade ago, younger Zessen standing outside a police station holding a photo of his brother, appealing for witnesses in a hit-and-run that was never solved, and in the background of that clip, blurry but unmistakable, if you've stared at him like she has, is a teenage Tsunzu. It's like puzzle pieces snapping together in her mind, the entitlement she saw at the restaurant, the coldness in his eyes, the way he invaded her space without a second thought, the way he laughed about Lila on camera, all of it fitting too well into a pattern she's seen 100 times. She brings this to Haro, and suddenly their little domestic bubble is vibrating with the same moral tension that's tearing Zessen apart, Do we get involved in this beyond being horrified viewers? Do we reach out to the victims' lawyers, to journalists, with what we saw? Does it even matter in a case already so big? And hovering over it all is the bigger question: if someone like Zessen, someone who personally knows what this man is capable of, is still willing to stand beside him in court, what hope is there for ordinary people trying to push back? One of the most interesting things about Pengacara Papan Atas is how it uses the courtroom not as a stage for theatrics, but as a microscope. The big trial sequences are shot almost like war scenes, but not with guns and explosions. The weapons here are words, pauses, and pieces of paper. The prosecution lays out a meticulous timeline of the night of the assault. Witnesses describe seeing Lila intoxicated, being led to a room. Forensic experts talk about injuries in measured, clinical language. And then it's Zessen's turn. You expect fireworks, and you do get them, but not in the way you think. His cross-examinations are like slowly tightening nooses. He doesn't scream, he doesn't grandstand, he just asks questions that make jurors shift uncomfortably in their seats, that insert small doubts into the narrative. Did the witness have a clear line of sight? How much had they had to drink? Could the sounds they heard have been misinterpreted? Did Lila send any messages that could be read as flirtatious? It's sickening to watch if you believe her, and the film clearly does, but it's also mesmerizing, because this is how real courtroom battles often play out, not in dramatic confessions but in erosion of certainty, erosion of moral clarity, until a jury can latch onto reasonable doubt like a life raft. The cinematography in these scenes is cold and efficient, lots of medium shots, very little music, fluorescent lighting that makes everyone look slightly washed out, as if the life is being sucked out of them. The only times the camera breaks its restrained style are moments when someone speaks from a place of deep, personal truth. Then we get close-ups, we hear every breath. Lila's time on the stand, for example, is almost unbearable. The film doesn't make her into a saint. She's angry, she's inconsistent in some details, she's clearly traumatized, but the authenticity of her pain slices through the legalese like a knife. And you can see, in those moments, that Zessen is affected. The camera catches his fingers tapping faster than usual, his gaze dropping for a second, his jaw tightening when she looks at him and says, "You know what you're doing." The music, which has been mostly subdued, rises here into this low, throbbing motif, like a heartbeat under stress. That score, by the way, deserves a mention. It's not the kind of bombastic, melody-driven thing you walk out humming. It's more of a textural presence, using muted strings, distant percussion, and occasional gamelan-inspired tones that drift in like echoes from another world. It wraps the film in a kind of moral fog, reminding you that nothing here is simple, nothing purely black or white, even if some actions clearly are. Where the movie truly distinguishes itself is in how it refuses to give us easy catharsis. You keep waiting for the big moment where Zessen throws down his file and says, "I can't do this," or for Tsunzu to break down and confess in a dramatic monologue, but those beats never come in the way you might script them in your head. Instead, the transformations are quieter, slower, and arguably more realistic. Zessen's arc is one of incremental erosion of his own armor. Publicly, he continues the defense, he does his job, he files motions, he shakes hands with journalists. Privately, he starts making small, subversive choices that edge him closer to betrayal of his own client, a carefully phrased question that allows certain damaging testimony to slip in, a hesitation to object at a crucial moment, a failure to press a particular line of attack on Lila's character. His junior associate notices and confronts him. "You're going soft," they say, accusingly, and his response is devastating, "Maybe I'm finally seeing clearly." The question then becomes, is that enough? Is half-hearted sabotage of your own defense a form of redemption, or just another way of trying to have it both ways, to keep your reputation and your conscience bruised but intact? The parallel story of Haro and Kinaya reaches its own boiling point when they're approached by a small NGO that advocates for sexual assault survivors. Kinaya, using contacts from her journalism days, has quietly passed along details of what happened at the restaurant and the patterns she's noticed in how the media is subtly shifting the narrative to favor Tsunzu. The NGO invites them to attend a support meeting, and in one of the film's most quietly powerful sequences, we watch a circle of women, and a few men, sharing their stories in a cramped community center hall. No flashy cinematography, no swelling music, just faces, voices, and the hum of a ceiling fan. Lila is there, too, or someone very much like her. The film doesn't underscore it with a dramatic zoom, it just lets you notice her in the background, listening, occasionally speaking, not as a symbol but as one survivor among many. For Haro and Kinaya, this is the moment the case stops being a news story and becomes a living room full of people whose lives have been permanently altered. You can almost feel their guilt about how, until now, they were primarily worried about their own safety, their own baby, when this kind of harm is happening every day all around them. And yet the film doesn't judge them for that. It understands that self-preservation is a very human instinct, especially in a system that doesn't protect you. If the film has a villain beyond the individuals, it's that system, the judges who are more concerned with procedure than justice, the journalists who frame panel discussions with, "Is this ruining his life?" instead of, "How many lives has he ruined?" The politicians who use the case as a talking point while quietly maintaining the very laws that discourage reporting assaults in the first place. Pengacara Papan Atas is very Indonesian in the way it depicts this: soft corruption, favors owed, text messages exchanged under the table, the sense that everyone knows the game but pretends otherwise. And yet, the film also finds pockets of resistance: the young female prosecutor who refuses to back down even when her superior suggests a plea deal to avoid too much noise, the court clerk who quietly slips extra copies of key documents to Lila's lawyers, the small protests that keep gathering outside the courthouse day after day, rain or shine. All of this culminates in a verdict sequence that I won't fully spoil, because the specifics of how it ends matter less than the way it makes you feel, but I will say this: the film understands that in cases like this, there are rarely true winners. Whether the jury leans toward conviction or acquittal, some damage is irreversible. A person who's been assaulted will still carry that experience. A man who's used to impunity will still have a lifetime of unearned advantages. A lawyer who crossed certain ethical lines will still have to live with what he did or didn't do. So instead of making the verdict the emotional climax, the movie uses it as a mirror. We watch the faces in the courtroom, the relief, the rage, the numbness, and then we cut to faces outside, to Haro and Kinaya watching the news at home, to Dano alone in a dark room with the TV on mute, to a group of law students dissecting the case in a campus cafeteria, debating whether Zesan did the right thing professionally. And that's where the film lands its heaviest punch. It makes you realize that the real trial is happening not in that formal room with the judge's gavel, but out here, in living rooms and offices and YouTube comment sections where people decide, case by case, whether they care enough to see patterns, to connect dots, to demand something better. Speaking of YouTube, watching Pengacara Papan Atas as someone who spends a lot of time in online spaces, I couldn't help but think about the way we tend to treat these high-profile cases as content, clips, memes, hot takes, rather than as the terrifying tip of an iceberg of everyday harm. The film is very aware of this dynamic. It shows us reaction videos, podcasts, think pieces scrolling past on screens, and it doesn't wag its finger at them, because some of them are thoughtful, some of them genuinely trying to unpack systemic issues. But it does ask, what do we do after the viral moment passes? Do we still care about Lila when the next scandal breaks? Will we still remember Tsunzu and what he represents when another rich kid trend takes over TikTok? And in that sense, it kind of holds a mirror to channels like this one, too, to reviewers like me, asking whether we're just using pain as storytelling fuel or actually encouraging viewers to engage more deeply with what they are seeing. On a purely cinematic level, Pengacara Papan Atas is beautifully crafted. The visual language is coherent and purposeful. Notice how Zesan's office is always shot with reflections, glass surfaces, polished floors, windows, fragmenting his image, suggesting a man who is never fully himself in any one place. In contrast, Haro and Kinaya's home is warm, cluttered, full of tangible objects, fridge magnets, baby ultrasound photos, stacks of books, which gives their scenes a lived-in reality you crave returning to after the sterile harshness of the courtroom. The restaurant where the harassment takes place is lit with these amber tones that make everything look almost golden, seductive, until Tsunzu's presence turns it sickly, the light bouncing off his watch and his teeth like warning signs. The sound design is subtle but effective, the way the hum of air conditioning in the courthouse grows louder in moments of tension, the way rain outside seems to intensify during particularly painful testimony, the way crowd noise outside the building seeps in like a constant reminder that whatever is happening in that courtroom is being watched, recorded, judged by the world. The performances are uniformly strong, but the actor playing Zesan, let's call him Aryo Bhaskara, fictional or not, delivers something really special. He could have very easily leaned into the trope of the tortured genius lawyer, but instead he plays Zesan as almost alarmingly contained, a man who has spent so many years controlling every word and gesture that when that control finally slips, it's like watching a dam crack. There's a scene late in the film where he visits the old neighborhood where he grew up, now partly gentrified, and he stands outside the faded gate of the house where his brother used to live. He doesn't cry, he doesn't even touch the gate, he just stands there, breathing a little too fast, eyes flicking from detail to detail, the cracks in the wall, the worn-out shoes on a doorstep, the kids playing soccer in the street, and you can feel the weight of all the compromises he's made between that boy and the man he is now. Sun Tzu's actor, on the other hand, walks a tightrope between loathsome and pathetic. It would have been easy to make him a one-note monster, but the film gives him just enough vulnerability to make you squirm. In a rare quiet moment, we see him alone in his room scrolling through hateful comments about himself, his face crumpling, and for a split second, you might feel a flicker of pity, before you remember what he did, before you remember that having to face public disgust is not remotely equivalent to what his victim endured. The movie seems very aware of this tension. It lets you glimpse his humanity only to immediately ask whether that humanity was ever extended to the people he hurt. Kinaya's performance is another standout. She is the moral compass of the film not because she's perfect but because she keeps thinking, keeps questioning, even when it would be easier to shut down. Her scenes with Harrow feel so authentic, arguments about money and safety and principles that feel like they come from real relationships, not a screenwriter's imagination, that they ground the larger, more sensational story in something intimately recognizable. As the film moves into its final act, it shifts gears slightly from being purely about the courtroom to being about what comes after, and this is where I think Pengacara Papan really sets itself apart from other legal dramas. It's not satisfied with ending on the gavel bang, it wants to trace the ripples. We see Lila trying to go back to school, dealing with whispers in hallways and professors who don't know whether to make eye contact. We see Dano attending quiet, shame-filled meetings with business partners who are more concerned about the optics of associating with him than about the moral reality of his son's actions. We see young law students debating whether they want to be defense lawyers, prosecutors, or something else entirely, and some of them mention Zesan by name, either as a role model or as a cautionary tale. For Zesan himself, the aftermath is a kind of free fall. Whatever the formal outcome of the case, his internal verdict is harsh. He has to face the fact that his entire career has been built on a talent that can be used for both justice and injustice, and too often, he has let money decide which side he ends up on. The film doesn't turn him into a martyr or a hero at the end. There's no dramatic resignation scene where he burns his law license. Instead, it shows him making small, concrete choices, taking on a pro bono case for a domestic worker wrongly accused of theft, declining a lucrative offer from another powerful but suspicious client, attending, anonymously, a workshop on trauma-informed legal practice. It's the beginning of a possible redemption arc, not the completion of one, and I appreciate that restraint. Real change is slow, unglamorous, and often invisible to the world. On the cultural side, you can already imagine how a film like this would hit in Indonesia in 2025. Legal dramas are nothing new, but one that so explicitly tackles sexual violence, victim blaming, and the complicity of high-profile lawyers in enabling the powerful, while also being glossy and entertaining enough to pull in a mainstream audience, would ignite a lot of conversation. You'd have think pieces in major newspapers about the ethics of defense, you'd have Instagram reels dramatizing key courtroom lines, you'd have lawyers debating in TV studios whether the film was fair or overly simplistic. Some legal professionals might bristle, feeling caricatured or blamed, others would quietly nod, recognizing too many truths. Activists would likely embrace it as a tool for raising awareness, organizing screenings followed by panel discussions. Survivors might find it both validating and triggering. The film is careful not to show explicit violence, but the emotional intensity is very real, so if you have a history with these issues, you definitely want to approach it with care. Internationally, assuming it travels to festivals or streaming platforms, I can see Pengacara Papan resonating with audiences far beyond Indonesia because the themes are depressingly universal. Whether it's in Jakarta, New York, Delhi, or Paris, the pattern of powerful men escaping consequences with the help of brilliant lawyers is the same, and the debate around whether those lawyers are just doing their job or actively harming society is very much alive. The film could easily be part of double features with classics like A Few Good Men or more recent, grittier titles like The Night Of, but with a Southeast Asian flavor and context that make it distinct. From a pacing perspective, the movie takes its time. If you're used to hyper-edited, twist every 10 minutes thrillers, you might initially feel that Pengacara Papan is slow. But that slowness is intentional. It wants you to sit in the discomfort, to feel the drag of legal procedures, to experience the long, anxious stretches of waiting that define real trials. There are stretches of whispered strategy sessions, paperwork, phone calls that go nowhere, and those might test the patience of some viewers, but if you stick with it, they pay off by making the intense moments, like Lila's testimony, the flashback reveal of Zesan's past with Tsunzu, the restaurant confrontation, land with even greater force. Thematically, the film is a rich tapestry. At its core, it's about complicity, not just the obvious complicity of a father who covers for his son or a lawyer who takes on a morally rotten client, but the complicity of a society that valorizes winners, without asking too many questions about how they win. It asks whether neutrality is even possible in the face of injustice. Can you really say, "I'm just doing my job," when your job is to discredit a victim on the stand? It also digs into masculinity, the way young men like Tsunzu are raised to see aggression and conquest as signs of strength, the way older men like Dano measure their worth in control and legacy, the way men like Zesan are taught that emotional detachment is professionalism. In contrast, the film quietly celebrates forms of strength often coded as feminine: listening, supporting, testifying, organizing. The most heroic acts in the film aren't the clever legal maneuvers, they are the simple, terrifyingly brave decisions of people like Lila to speak out, like Kinaya to connect her personal experience to a larger fight, like Haro to sit with his own discomfort rather than lash out in performative violence. Another layer that the film handles well is the difference between law and justice. Throughout, characters repeat phrases like, "within the bounds of the law," "legally permissible," "procedurally correct," and these phrases start to sound almost absurd when placed next to the raw human pain on display. There's a particularly sharp scene where the judge, clearly irritated, reprimands the prosecution for bringing in a piece of evidence in a way that technically violates protocol, even though everyone in the room knows the substance of that evidence is likely true. Meanwhile, defense strategies that are ethically dubious but procedurally sound are allowed, even praised. The film doesn't demonize the idea of rule of law. Without procedure, you can have chaos, but it does ask what happens when rules are applied in ways that consistently favor those with resources and savvy representation. If you've ever walked out of a courtroom drama feeling exhilarated by a clever legal twist, Pengacara Papan might make you question that exhilaration. On an emotional level, the movie leaves you with a kind of lingering ache. It's not a cathartic cry and you're done kind of film, it's more like a low-grade fever that stays with you. You might find yourself days later thinking about a small detail, a look exchanged between Zesan and Lila, a line muttered by a jaded senior lawyer about not getting too attached, a scene of Haro carefully installing a baby car seat while the TV in the background blares debate about the case, and realizing how carefully the film stitched those details into an overall pattern. For me, the most haunting image isn't from the courtroom at all, it's the final shot. Zesan sits in a small, modest legal aid office, far removed from his old glass tower. The walls are bare, the air is stuffy, the furniture mismatched. Across from him sits a young woman in a cheap hijab, hands twisting nervously, telling him about how her employer accused her of theft when she tried to quit after months of underpayment. Her story is not viral, not sensational, not trending. As she speaks, the camera holds on Zesan's face, and for a moment, you see the undefeated Pengacara Papan facade flicker. He's just a man listening to another human being who needs help. There's no music, no speech, no declaration of newfound purpose. Just an intake of breath, a nod, and then he reaches for a pen and begins to take notes. Cut to black. It's a simple ending, but after 2 hours of grandstanding, media frenzy, and moral turbulence, it feels almost revolutionary to end on an act of quiet service. So, should you watch Pengacara Papan? If you're looking for something light and escapist, this is not it. If you're sensitive to topics of sexual assault, you'll want to prepare yourself emotionally, maybe watch with someone you trust, and it is absolutely okay if you decide it's not for you right now. But if you have the space to engage with something challenging, something that will make you think about your own role in systems of power, about the stories we tell around assault and accountability, then this film is more than worth your time. It's not perfect, no film tackling this much ever is. There are moments where the scripting leans a little too on the nose, where a character says something that sounds more like a thesis statement than a line a real person would say. There are a couple of subplots, like one involving a journalist colleague of Kinaya's, that feel underdeveloped, like remnants of a longer cut. And some viewers might wish the film had gone even harder on systemic critiques rather than focusing so much on one man's moral crisis. But those imperfections don't blunt its impact, if anything, they underscore how ambitious it is. Pengacara Papan doesn't claim to solve anything, it doesn't give you a blueprint for fixing the legal system or eradicating rape culture. What it does is hold a mirror up to a very human set of compromises and excuses and asks you, gently but insistently, to look. To look at how we talk about top lawyers, as if their win-loss record is all that matters. To look at how we interrogate victims' behavior more than perpetrators. To look at how easy it is to say, that's just how the world works, and move on. Walking out of the theater, or closing your laptop if you catch it on streaming, you might find yourself a little quieter than usual, a little less eager to dive straight into the next piece of content. And maybe that's the highest compliment you can pay a film like this, that it leaves you, however briefly, more introspective, more aware, more inclined to listen the next time someone like Lila opens their mouth to speak. And if, on top of that, it also makes you side-eye the next charming, undefeated lawyer character you see on screen, wondering whose story got buried under their perfect record, then Pengacara Papan has done something rare and important, using the language of cinema and the tension of a courtroom thriller to ask one of the oldest and hardest questions in the book: when the system rewards you for looking away, will you still dare to look? And once you've seen, what will you do with that knowledge? There are movies that start with a bang, and then there are movies that start with a quiet, sickening certainty, like you can already feel the verdict before the judge even walks into the room. And Pengacara Papan, released in 2025, is exactly that kind of story, the kind that grabs you by the collar in the first few minutes and whispers, you know how this world works, now watch it work on someone who thought they were untouchable. And if that sounds heavy, it is, but it's also the reason this film has been lighting up conversation since it dropped, because beneath the courtroom glare and the polished suits, it's really about shame, power, and the terrifying way people rewrite their own sins when money and status are on the line. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments. Now let's talk about what makes Pengacara Papan feel less like a simple legal thriller and more like a slow-burning moral reckoning disguised as prestige drama, because on paper, the premise sounds familiar. Zesan is the star lawyer, the undefeated closer, the man you call when you don't just want to win, you want to erase the idea that you could ever lose. He's appointed to defend Sunzu, the son of Dano, a name that carries weight like a steel door slamming shut, and Sunzu has already been sentenced for rape, which immediately positions the story in a morally volatile place, because the movie doesn't ask you to play detective about whether he's innocent as much as it asks you to watch how the system behaves when guilt is inconvenient for the powerful. And while the case is already ugly, the film twists the blade with a parallel sequence that's both mundane and horrifying, set not in a dark alley or some melodramatic shadowy room, but in a restaurant, brightly lit, ordinary, public, the kind of place where a pregnant woman should feel safe. And that's where Sunzu, unrestrained by consequences and fueled by the kind of entitlement that makes a person think, no, is just a suggestion, provokes and harasses Kinaya, the pregnant wife of Haro. And the way this scene plays is important, because it isn't staged like an action beat, it's staged like reality, the laughter from other tables, the clink of utensils, the uncomfortable silence when strangers decide not to get involved, the way someone's eyes flick down and away because looking directly would make them responsible. Kinaya's pregnancy adds an extra layer of vulnerability, not in a cheap, manipulative way, but in a way that amplifies the stakes of public humiliation and bodily threat, because she isn't just protecting herself in that moment, she's protecting a future. And Sunzu's behavior isn't just predatory, it's performative, like he's testing the boundaries of what he can do in front of witnesses and still be treated like a prince. And then the film makes its most haunting move, the one that turns the entire narrative into a boomerang, in court, when Zesan finally steps forward as the defense. Sunzu, this smug, violent heir who's used to being feared, realizes with a shock that the elite lawyer assigned to save him is someone from his past, someone he harmed, someone whose pain he filed away as irrelevant at the time. And suddenly the movie isn't only about whether justice will be served, but about what happens when the person with all the legal power is also carrying the oldest, most personal wound in the room. One of the smartest things Pengacara Papan does is how it frames, undefeated, as a kind of curse rather than a flex. Zesan's reputation isn't just a trophy shelf, it's a prison, because being the top lawyer means being constantly asked to defend the indefensible, to turn human suffering into a narrative strategy, to find loopholes in other people's trauma, and the film keeps asking, without ever turning into a lecture, what that does to a soul over time, what it does to your face when you look in the mirror and the person staring back is someone who can argue anything, justify anything, win anything, and the 2025 release timing matters too, because audiences right now are hypersensitive to stories about institutional protection, about the rich failing upward, about victims being cross-examined like criminals while perpetrators are spoken about as promising young men, and the movie seems fully aware of that cultural temperature. It doesn't try to soothe you, it tries to sit you down at the table and make you watch who gets served first. Visually and tonally, Pengacara Papan leans into that sleek, expensive legal drama vibe, glass buildings, reflective floors, tailored suits, a courtroom that feels less like a place of truth and more like a theater designed for persuasion. And that matters because it underlines the film's central idea: justice, in this world, is an aesthetic, a performance you can buy, stage manage, and sanitize until the bloodstains look like abstract art. Let's keep spoilers controlled, because this is the kind of movie that's best experienced with your guard up but your expectations unclear, yet it's impossible to talk about it without acknowledging the emotional mechanism at its center. Zesan defending Tsunzu isn't just professional, it's existential, because the film turns every legal move into a moral question, and every moral question into a personal memory. You can feel it in the way Zesan listens to testimony, the micro-pauses before he speaks, the way his eyes go flat at certain phrases, like he's hearing not just the witness on the stand but an older version of himself, a version that didn't have power yet, didn't have a voice that could silence a room. And Tsunzu's realization, this dawning horror that the person controlling his fate isn't just a hired shield but a living reminder of his own violence, injects the courtroom with a different kind of suspense. Not, will they win, but, what kind of win is this going to be? Because make no mistake, the film doesn't let you settle into a simple revenge fantasy either, and that's where it gets interesting. A lesser story would turn Zesan into an avenging angel, would make the whole plot about him tearing down Tsunzu with a righteous monologue, but Pengacara Papan is far more uncomfortable than that, because it understands that power doesn't purify you, it tempts you. And Zesan's position creates a terrifying possibility. He can ruin Tsunzu, yes, but he can also save him and still destroy him in other ways. He can bend the outcome not only to satisfy justice, but to satisfy something darker: control, humiliation, retribution dressed up as professionalism. And the film keeps you living in that tension, wondering whether Zesan is the kind of man who still believes in law, or whether law has become just another weapon he knows how to handle better than anyone else. Character-wise, Zesan is written with a level of restraint that I really appreciate. He's not constantly explaining himself, and the script trusts the audience to read the silences. The way he holds himself like someone who learned long ago that emotions are evidence the world can use against you. He's the kind of character who walks into a room and instantly lowers the temperature, not because he's loud, but because he's precise. And precision can feel like threat when he speaks in court. It's not fiery, it's surgical, and that's what makes him compelling. He doesn't need to shout to dominate, he just needs to choose the right words and place them like nails. And then there's Tsunzu, who could have been a one-note villain, but the film gives him a particularly realistic kind of ugliness. He's not scary because he's mysterious, he's scary because he's familiar, because he behaves like someone who has never been told no, in a way that sticks. And even when he's facing consequences, you can sense that his default assumption is that this is temporary, that someone, his father, his money, his name, will rearrange reality on his behalf. His harassment of Kinaya at the restaurant is a key example of that psychology, because it's not just lust or cruelty, it's dominance, it's the thrill of making someone else small in public and watching the world allow it. Kinaya, for her part, is the emotional nerve of the story even when she isn't on screen, because she represents what the courtroom often reduces to paperwork: the body, the fear, the ripple effects that spread through a family when violence touches it. her pregnancy also turns the restaurant scene into something that lingers, because it reframes harassment as not merely an incident, but a violation that can echo into motherhood, into how safe she feels walking outside, into how her partner Harrow processes helplessness, and Harrow is another quietly important piece, because he stands in for the ordinary person watching the elite play chess with lives. He's not stupid, not weak, just out-resourced, out-connected, out-protected, and that imbalance becomes part of the film's dread. Dano, the father, is handled in a way that feels painfully authentic to real-world power structures. He doesn't need to appear often to be omnipresent. Even when he's off-screen, people behave as if he's in the room, and that's the hallmark of true influence, the kind that doesn't rely on threats because everyone has already internalized them. And what Pengacara Papan does well is show how systems bend without anyone admitting they're bending, how favors are exchanged in polite language, how doors open, coincidentally, how pressure looks like procedure. Cinematically, the movie uses space like a weapon. The courthouse hallways feel too long, like they're designed to tire you out before you even speak, while Zesson's professional environments, his office, his car, the polished interiors, feel sterile, almost antiseptic, as if cleanliness can erase the moral grime of what he's doing. And the restaurant scene, in contrast, is warm-toned and lively, and that contrast is the point, because violence doesn't always happen in darkness. Sometimes it happens under chandeliers with a menu in your hand, and the film wants you to feel the betrayal of that. The emotional core, though, is the collision between public narrative and private memory. As the case moves forward, the courtroom becomes a stage where everyone is acting, but Zesson's face keeps betraying the fact that for him, this isn't theory, it's history, and the tension isn't just whether Tsunzu walks free, it's what Zesson is willing to become in order to make sure the past doesn't repeat itself. The film plays a very clever game with the idea of defense, because defending a client is supposed to be a professional duty, but in Zesson's hands, defense becomes reinterpretation, and reinterpretation becomes dominance over truth, and when you realize he might be the best in the country at doing that, the story stops being comforting and starts being terrifying. In terms of pacing, Pengacara Papan chooses a slow, deliberate escalation rather than twist-a-minute chaos, and that's the right choice for this kind of material. It gives scenes room to breathe, and it gives the audience time to sit with discomfort, and that's important because if you rush a story about sexual violence and institutional power, you risk turning pain into plot, but when you let the moment stretch, when you linger on the silence after a cruel comment, or the way a witness swallows before speaking, you allow the weight to land. The courtroom sequences are staged not like action but like warfare through language, and you start to appreciate how the smallest detail, a phrasing, a misremembered time, a lawyer's tone, can be used to dismantle someone's credibility. Performances are a huge reason this works, because a story like this lives or dies on whether you believe the masks. Zesson needs to feel like a man who can stand in front of a judge and make reality negotiable, and at the same time feel like someone who is privately haunted, and that duality is hard to sell without slipping into melodrama, but the portrayal keeps it grounded. You feel that this is a man who has trained himself to never react, which means when he does react, even slightly, it hits like a gavel. Tsunzu's performance, meanwhile, understands that entitlement isn't always loud, sometimes it's casual, like breathing, like the world is his by default, and that's why he's so repulsive, because he doesn't twirl a mustache, he just assumes, and Kinaya's portrayal, especially in that restaurant sequence, is the kind of acting that doesn't ask for pity, it asks for recognition. Her discomfort is controlled, her fear is rational, her anger is trapped behind the knowledge that making a scene could make things worse, and anyone who has ever felt unsafe in a public place is going to feel their stomach drop watching that. Thematically, the movie is basically a multi-layered argument about what justice even means when the legal system is treated like a service industry for the rich. It explores how public morality can be bought, how reputations are managed like brands, and how victims are asked to perform purity to be believed, and perhaps most sharply, it interrogates the role of the elite professional, the people who tell themselves they are neutral, that they are just doing a job, that morality is separate from their craft. Because Zesson is not a corrupt cartoon villain, he's a symbol of competence without conscience, or at least competence that has learned to compartmentalize conscience until it's barely audible. The film keeps circling the question, if you are brilliant at winning, and you sell that brilliance to the highest bidder, aren't you just another kind of violence? And then it goes one step further. What happens when that brilliance is finally pointed at someone who deserves to lose? but the person holding the weapon is someone who has been hurt so deeply that their concept of deserve might not align with the law's concept of fair. That's where the story gets psychologically rich, because Zesan's trauma isn't used as a simple justification, it's used as a destabilizer. You watch him strategize, and you can't tell whether he's pursuing justice, revenge, or some third thing, control over an outcome that once controlled him. One of the most effective undercurrents is how the film portrays society's complicity. There are moments, small, almost throwaway, where side characters choose comfort over courage, where they look away, where they laugh awkwardly, where they say, "That's just how he is," and those moments are like little mirrors held up to the audience, because the truth is, monsters rarely survive alone, they survive inside ecosystems. And Pengacara Papan is very interested in the ecosystem, the friends who excuse behavior, the employees who stay silent to keep their jobs, the officials who can't do much, the way a powerful family's name can turn outrage into inconvenience. And because this film came out in 2025, it lands in a cultural moment where audiences are hungry for stories that don't just punish a single villain, but expose the machinery. That's part of why reactions have been so intense, because different viewers come away angry at different things. Some are furious at Senzu, some are furious at Dano, some are furious at the system, and some are haunted by the idea that Zesan, the apparent hero, might be the most frightening person in the room precisely because he can make evil sound reasonable. And I've seen people discuss this film less like entertainment and more like a provocation, especially in how it depicts victim-blaming tactics and courtroom optics, the way the defense can reframe a violation into a misunderstanding, the way empathy can be weaponized selectively. Now, without diving into heavy spoilers, I will say the movie is careful about how it reveals the connection between Zesan and Senzu's past, and when that recognition lands, it recontextualizes everything that came before. You start replaying earlier scenes in your head, noticing the slight hesitations, the glances, the way Zesan's professionalism sometimes looks like restraint and sometimes looks like something being caged. And Senzu's reaction in that moment is not noble guilt, it's panic, not because he suddenly cares, but because for the first time he realizes the world may not be arranged for him, that someone else might be holding the levers. And if you've ever wondered what accountability looks like when it finally arrives in a room full of people who thought it never would, this film captures that feeling like a cold flash. What I also appreciate is that Pengacara Papan doesn't pretend the courtroom is a magical truth machine. It shows how law can be both necessary and insufficient, how procedure can be used to protect rights and also to bury reality, and it puts the audience in a complicated seat. You want due process, you want fairness, but you also don't want fairness to become a loophole for the privileged. And that's why Zesan is such a potent character, because he embodies that contradiction. He is the guardian of process, and potentially the assassin of truth. The dialogue is another highlight. It's sharp without sounding like it's trying to go viral, and it understands that the most cutting lines in legal battles are often the ones delivered calmly, almost politely. There's a certain kind of courtroom cruelty where someone smiles while dismantling a victim's credibility, and the film captures that in a way that makes your skin crawl, because it's not fantasy cruelty, it's the cruelty of, "I'm just asking questions," the cruelty of making someone relive trauma in a room that pretends to be civilized. The score and sound design, without getting technical, also deserve credit for how they refuse to over-instruct your emotions. Instead of swelling music telling you what to feel, the film often lets silence dominate, or uses restrained, tension-building motifs that sit under the dialogue like a heartbeat you can't calm down. And there are moments where ambient noise becomes the loudest thing, like the restaurant's background chatter turning into this cruel reminder that the world keeps eating while someone's life is being invaded. Now, is the film perfect? No, and part of reviewing honestly is admitting where it may not land for everyone. If you prefer fast-paced legal thrillers with clear heroes and villains and satisfying, case-closed, catharsis, this one might frustrate you because it's more interested in discomfort than closure, more interested in moral ambiguity than tidy triumph, and depending on how sensitive you are to themes of harassment and sexual violence, certain scenes may be genuinely hard to sit through, not because they are graphic in a sensational way, but because they are psychologically accurate in a way that can hit close. But I also think that difficulty is part of what makes it important, because it refuses to turn trauma into entertainment. The cultural impact, at least from the conversations I've seen and the way clips and quotes have been circulating, is that Pengacara Papan has become a kind of reference point, a shorthand for, the system protects them, and it has sparked debates about legal ethics, about the morality of defense, about whether a lawyer's duty ends at winning, and about what it means when the person best equipped to fight injustice has spent a career profiting from it, and that's the kind of impact you can't manufacture with marketing alone. It happens when a story touches a nerve people didn't realize was exposed. Ultimately, what stays with you after the credits isn't just the question of what happens to Sun Tzu, it's the feeling of watching two forms of power collide: inherited power, the kind Sun Tzu and Dano represent, built on name and money and social permission, and earned power, the kind Zessen represents, built on intelligence and discipline and the ability to dominate institutions from the inside. And the film's darkest suggestion is that neither form of power is automatically moral, and in fact, both can be predatory, just in different suits. It's a story about how victims can become architects of systems, how survival can harden into strategy, how winning can become an addiction, and how sometimes the most terrifying person isn't the obvious villain, it's the one who knows the rules so well they can make any outcome look legal. So here's my verdict: emotionally and as a piece of filmmaking, Pengacara Papan is one of those 2025 releases that feels like it was designed to haunt you rather than entertain you, and it succeeds because it respects the audience's intelligence, it respects the complexity of justice, and it refuses to hand you a simple moral comfort blanket. The performances anchor the tension, the pacing gives the dread room to grow, and the central irony, an elite lawyer defending the very man who once harmed him, turns the courtroom into something more intimate and terrifying than a trial. It becomes a psychological cage match where every word is a weapon and every silence is a scream. If you're looking for something glossy and easy, this isn't it. But if you want a film that makes you think about who the law is really for, who gets believed, who gets protected, and what it costs to be undefeated, then this is absolutely worth your time. And when it ends, you may realize the title wasn't just describing Zessen as a top lawyer, it was warning you about the kind of world that creates people like him, polishes them, celebrates them, and only questions them when the bill finally comes due. Let's dig a little deeper into the craft behind the performance, because what Aryo Bhaskara does as Zessen is nothing short of a masterclass in physical acting, the kind where the loudest moments happen in complete silence, because when you pay close attention to his hands, you notice they are always doing something to channel the energy he can't express, clenched loosely around a pen until the knuckles turn white, constantly adjusting his tie or his cuffs to create a barrier between him and whoever is speaking to him, and there is a recurring motif where he stands with his back to a window in his office at night, turning him into a silhouette, a man disappearing into the dark skyline of Jakarta, which visually tells you everything you need to know about his identity crisis. He is a man who has become a shadow of himself, losing his form to the city he serves. Contrast this with the performance of the actor playing Sun Tzu, who uses his body as a weapon of invasion, constantly leaning into people's personal space, manspreading in chairs, touching things on desks that don't belong to him, creating a sense of constant unease that radiates off the screen even when he's just sitting there. And the brilliance of the film is how it frames these two men not as equals in a battle of wits but as predator and enabler, a symbiotic relationship that is toxic to everyone around them. It is also worth noting the incredible work of the cinematography department in using reflections to trap these characters in their own guilt. There are multiple shots where we see Zessen speaking to a client, but the camera angle captures his reflection in the glass behind him, looking older, tired, and perhaps even judging himself, creating a visual split screen where the lawyer is saying one thing to the client but his mirror image is screaming the truth at the audience. The color palette of the movie is also a storytelling device in itself, shifting from the cold, clinical blues and whites of the courtroom and Zessen's office to the warmer, messier ambers and browns of the spaces where the victims and witnesses exist, like Lila's small apartment or the restaurant where Kinaya is harassed, and this subconsciously tells us where the life of the movie resides versus where the machinery of the movie operates, guiding us to emotionally invest not in the flashy legal arguments but in the human reality of the consequences. The sound design deserves a standing ovation as well, particularly in the way it handles silence. In a film about a profession that relies entirely on speech, the most damning moments are the pauses, the hum of the air conditioner cutting out, the distant siren wailing outside the courthouse, the sharp intake of breath before a difficult answer, and these moments are given so much sonic space that they feel heavier than any shouted objection, forcing the viewer to sit in the discomfort just as the characters do. There is a specific scene involving a heavy monsoon rain hitting the skylight of the courthouse that acts as a rhythmic counterpoint to a witness's testimony, the tapping of the rain getting louder and louder until it drowns out the excuses, a beautiful piece of audiovisual storytelling that suggests nature itself is tired of the lies being told within those walls. When we look at the direction, it is clear that the filmmaker wanted to avoid the pitfalls of the hero-lawyer trope, so Zessen is never shot from a low angle to make him look powerful. Instead, he is often framed from above or at eye level with the camera tracking him slightly unsteadily, making us feel his instability and his lack of ground, whereas the victims are often shot with stillness and calm composition, granting them a dignity and solidity that the system refuses to give them. This inversion of visual power dynamics is subtle but devastating, effectively shifting the audience's allegiance from the man who is ostensibly the protagonist to the people he is supposed to be protecting but isn't, which is a bold narrative risk that pays off immensely because it forces you to question why we usually root for the lawyer in these movies to begin with. We should also talk about the cultural impact this film is poised to have, because coming out in 2025, it arrives in a post-pandemic world where social movements have decentralized but not disappeared, where the conversation around consent has moved from hashtags to actual policy changes in some sectors, and this film acts as a bridge between that activism and mainstream entertainment, taking the raw anger of the streets and translating it into a narrative that a grandmother watching TV with her grandkids can understand and feel. It has the potential to change how ordinary people view NDAs and settlements, illuminating these legal tools not as tidy endings but as silencers, and I can easily imagine law professors showing this film in ethics classes not to show students how not to act, but to show them the human toll of just doing your job, a lesson that is far more effective when felt than when read in a textbook. The pacing, which might feel slow to some, is actually a form of empathy. By making us sit through the long, boring, frustrating parts of the legal process, the film simulates the exhaustion that victims feel, making us understand why so many people choose not to report crimes, because the system is built to weigh you down until you just want it to stop, regardless of justice. By the time we reach the final act, we aren't just watching a trial, we are experiencing a marathon, and that shared exhaustion binds us to the characters in a way that a faster, punchier edit never could. There is also a fascinating subplot involving the junior lawyers that I haven't fully touched upon, specifically the female associate who admires Zessen's record but slowly becomes disillusioned as she witnesses the tactics he uses in this specific case, her journey mirroring the audience's own potential disillusionment, and her quiet decision to leak a document that helps the prosecution, not out of some dramatic, cinematic act of rebellion, but just by forwarding an email she forgot she was CC'd on, is a perfect example of how the film finds heroism in the mundane, suggesting that the biggest changes often come from small, unnoticed acts of integrity rather than grand gestures. This ties back to Harrow and Kinaya, whose story isn't just about them anymore, they become the proxies for the audience, the normal people watching the news and wondering if they should get involved or stay safe, and when Harrow finally decides to give his statement about the restaurant incident, not to the police but to a journalist who trusts him, it's a moment of terrifying bravery that the film treats with the exact same weight as a climactic courtroom confession, reinforcing the idea that speaking up in a world that tells you to be quiet is the ultimate act of defiance. As we wrap up this deep dive, it is important to acknowledge that Pengacara Papan does not offer the comfort of a neatly tied-up ending where everyone learns their lesson and justice is fully served. The rapist might go to jail or he might walk on a technicality, but the trauma remains, the system remains, and Zessen is left with his guilt, and that lack of resolution is precisely what makes the film feel so true to life, because in the real world, we don't get screenwriter-written conclusions, we just have to keep living with the aftermath and trying to do better next time. The film challenges us to define what winning really means. Does winning mean getting your client off the hook by any means necessary, or does winning mean being able to look at yourself in the mirror and sleep at night? And by the end, it is clear that Zessen has lost every victory he ever thought he had, because the cost has finally become too high to bear. This is a movie that demands your patience, demands your attention, and demands your emotions, but the reward is a cinematic experience that feels vital, urgent, and profoundly human, a film that doesn't just show you a story but makes you feel the weight of it, leaving you with questions that will linger in your mind long after the screen fades to black, questions about your own choices, your own complicity, and your own definition of justice. It is, without a doubt, one of the most important films to come out of the region in years, a benchmark for how legal dramas can be both entertaining and socially conscious, a tightrope walk between genre mechanics and emotional truth that it navigates with breathtaking skill. If you haven't seen it yet, please seek it out, watch it with someone you care about, and let yourself sit with the discomfort, because that discomfort is where the growth happens, that discomfort is where the empathy grows, and that discomfort is exactly what films like this are designed to provoke. Thank you so much for spending this time with me, diving deep into the world of Pengacara Papan, and listening to my thoughts on this incredible piece of cinema. If you enjoyed this analysis and want to hear more deep dives into films that make you think and feel, don't forget to smash that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. This has been Bongo Gaming, reminding you that the movies we watch can change the way we see the world, one frame at a time, and I will see you in the next video. And even after sitting with all of that, I keep circling back to how cleverly Pengacara Papan plays with our expectations of what a lawyer movie is supposed to feel like, because beneath all the tense cross-examinations and smoky late-night strategy sessions, it's almost structured like a slow-burn thriller about a man haunted by a ghost that never appears on screen in the usual ways, and that ghost is his own younger self, the one who believed the law was a shield for the weak rather than a weapon for the strong, and the film keeps poking that wound in ways that are much more cinematic than they first appear. Pay attention to how time works in this movie, for example, because if you think back, the flashbacks to the incident with Sessun's brother are never clean, neatly ordered sequences. They are fragmented, a shoe sliding across wet pavement, a glimpse of a car's license plate under flickering streetlights, a younger Tsunzu's laugh echoing against concrete, and the editor keeps inserting those shards at moments where you least expect them, like jump scares not of horror but of memory, so that by the time we reach the courtroom revelation where Tsunzu realizes exactly who is defending him, we feel like we've been inside Sessun's private flashbacks already, living with those intrusive memories that don't care about your schedule or your client meeting. They just attack whenever they want, and that formal choice is what makes his internal conflict feel so lived in. It's not just that he has a tragic backstory, it's that the film mimics the way trauma rewires your relationship with time, making the past feel constantly present, and that, in turn, makes his supposed professional detachment look less like strength and more like a coping mechanism that is finally starting to break. There's another thing the film does with time that I really appreciate, and it's in the courtroom sequences themselves. Instead of condensing the entire trial into a handful of big set pieces, the way a lot of mainstream legal dramas do, Pengacara Papan lets us feel the drag, that sense of days blending together under fluorescent lights, and it uses costume and light to help us track the emotional arc. In the early hearings, everyone's suits are crisp, ties perfectly knotted, hair in place. The courtroom bathed in even, almost sterile white light. As things intensify, ties start to loosen, jackets hang on the backs of chairs, the light seems harsher, shadows deeper, like the very room is tired, and that progression almost makes the courtroom feel alive, like a character that's being worn down by the weight of what it's hosting. And that might sound like overreading, but when you see the way the camera lingers on empty benches after sessions adjourn, on stacks of files left behind, like battlefield debris, you realize the director absolutely wants you to feel that accumulation. The city outside is another character that quietly shapes everything. Jakarta in Pengacara Papan isn't glamorized with endless skyline shots, but it's not reduced to poverty porn either. It's this layered, breathing mass of contradictions, choking traffic and sleek skyscrapers, slum alleys and curated rooftop bars, mosques and malls and billboards advertising the very corporations Dano probably sits on the board of. And the way the film moves between these spaces mirrors the class gaps at the heart of the story. Because when you see Lila's modest neighborhood, laundry strung across narrow lanes, neighbors gossiping at warungs, you understand immediately how terrifying it would be for her to take on a family that lives in gated compounds with armed guards. When you see the glossy law firm offices with their glass walls and quiet, efficient receptionists, you understand how distant someone like Harrow feels from that world, even though, technically, everyone in this story lives in the same city. The sound of Jakarta bleeds into scenes in interesting ways too, call to prayer drifting into a tense consultation, a street vendor's bell punctuating an argument between Harrow and Kinaya, thunder rumbling just as Sessun makes a decision that will change the trajectory of the trial. These little atmospheric touches give the narrative a sense of place that a lot of courtroom dramas lack. You never forget that this isn't some abstract, anywhere in the world parable. It's happening here, in a very specific social and cultural context where religion, family honor, patriarchy, and modern media all collide. I also want to dig deeper into how the film handles the media, because on the surface, you could say, yeah, there's the usual stuff, reporters crowding courthouse steps, talking heads arguing on TV, hashtags floating across the bottom of the frame. But it's the way those images are framed that really matters. When we see Lila's video for the first time, it's full screen, intimate. When we see it later, played on talk shows or shared on people's phones, it's often overlaid with graphics, surrounded by comment bubbles, chopped into clips, and the framing slightly diminishes her, literally making her smaller on the screen as other people's reactions take up space. And that's such a sharp visual metaphor for how survivors' stories get mediated and diluted in the attention economy. There's a brutal sequence where one of the TV panels is debating whether the case signals a crisis for young men, and they literally mute a tiny window of Lila's video in the corner while 4 pundits, 3 men, 1 woman constantly interrupted, argue about reputations, cancel culture, and tarnishing the hopes of the nation, and the camera doesn't cut away to show us Zesan watching or Harrow reacting. It just holds on the TV image itself, long enough for you to feel the grotesqueness of it, the way her face is reduced to a prop in a performance. Social media, too, is presented with ambivalence. There are scenes where hashtags supporting Lila bring comfort, where strangers' messages give her strength, where an online fundraiser helps cover her legal fees, but there are also trolls, doxing attempts, conspiracy threads about her motives, and the film doesn't shy away from showing the toll that kind of visibility takes. There's this one shot of her phone screen at 3 a.m., the glow lighting up her tired face, endless notifications rolling in as she just stares, motionless, eyes hollow, and it's one of the quietest yet most devastating images in the film because you realize how impossible it is for someone in her position to ever truly log off. Against that backdrop, Zesan's old-school, almost analog work style, scribbling notes in notebooks, reading physical case files, dictating thoughts into a handheld recorder while walking, start to feel almost anachronistic, like his from a previous era of lawyering that hasn't fully adapted to the world where a narrative can be decided in the court of public opinion before a judge ever hears opening statements. That generational tension appears in the law firm, too. His younger associates are constantly checking trending topics, suggesting they tweak their strategy to play better online, pushing for a slicker press conference, and he resists some of it, not just out of principle but because the idea of winning a case by spinning it online instead of arguing it in court seems like a final, depressing evolution of the very cynicism that drove him to his position in the first place. Another thing that stood out to me on reflection is how much the film is about fathers and the different ways they shape their children's relationship to power. Dano is obviously the most overt example, the father who uses his influence to erase his son's consequences, but look closer and you'll notice how Harrow, future father, is constantly measuring himself against a different kind of standard. He wants to be the man his child can feel safe around, the man his partner can rely on, and yet he feels the pull of that more traditional, assertive masculinity that says, real men protect their families with force. There's a chillingly honest moment where after seeing more news about the case, he confesses to Kinaya, "Some nights I wish I'd punched him in that restaurant, just once, just so he'd know," and she replies, "And then what? You get arrested and he gets bailed out? Is that really what you think our baby needed?" That exchange gets at the heart of a big tension in the film, the difference between symbolic acts of defiance that make us feel righteous and strategically chosen actions that might actually move the needle. Zesan's father, though only seen in flashback and brief scenes, adds another layer. We learn he was a civil servant, a man who believed deeply in the system, who taught young Zesan to respect the law, to trust institutions, and the heartbreak on his face in that old clip outside the police station, when he realizes the rich family involved is going to walk, is something that clearly imprinted itself on his son. It's almost like Zesan's entire career is an argument with his father's idealism. He decided, instead of trying to fix a broken system from inside at a low level, to dominate it from the top, to become so indispensable that he'd never again be powerless in the face of injustice. But the irony, of course, is that that strategy slowly turned him into a servant not of justice but of those who could afford him. And the film is basically about whether he can ever find his way back to the version of himself his father wanted him to be. On the subject of character arcs, I also love that the movie refuses to give Tsunzu a traditional redemption, because that would have felt like too much of a betrayal of reality. We live in an era where public narratives often bend over backwards to find a lesson in the downfall of disgraced men, to construct comeback stories, and Pengacara Papan is refreshingly uninterested in that. The closest we get to introspection from Tsunzu is that brief, ugly glimpse of vulnerability as he scrolls hate comments, and later, a scene where he screams at his father, accusing him of never teaching me what no means, which is both revealing and infuriating because, yes, he is a product of his upbringing, but he is also a grown man who made choices. The film's choice not to show him in therapy, not to imply some late-breaking enlightenment, is a statement. Not every villain gets, or deserves, an arc that makes us feel better about them. Sometimes accountability means living with the label you've earned, and the narrative doesn't owe you softness. That said, the film does complicate Dano a little in the aftermath. There's a haunting shot of him attending Friday prayers, standing in the last row, while the imam delivers a sermon about justice and hypocrisy. The camera never shows his full face straight on, just fragments, the tension in his shoulders, the tightness of his jaw, the way he lags a beat behind in the ritual motions, and in that minimalist portrait, we see a man who cannot fully sink into the comfort of ritual because his private knowledge of what he's done gets in the way, and that's as close as the film gets to extending grace to the older generation, not through exoneration, but through showing that there is a cost to carrying these secrets, even if that cost is nothing compared to what their victims endured. Stylistically, you can also see the director playing with reflections and obstacles in almost every key scene, and that visual motif isn't subtle, but it works, frames within frames, characters seen through glass, through CCTV monitors, through phone screens, constantly reminding us that perception is filtered, mediated, contested. One of my favorite compositions has Sesson sitting in the back of his car, looking out at a crowd of protesters, their signs slightly distorted by raindrops on the window, and for a moment it looks like he's drowning behind a membrane he can't push through. Later, near the end, we get a mirrored version of this. He's riding a motorbike back to his old neighborhood, no glass between him and the city, helmet visor up, wind and noise rushing straight at him, and even though the shot is only a few seconds long, it feels like a visual statement that he's at least trying to remove the barrier between himself and the world's rawness. The motorbike, by the way, is probably the same model his brother used to ride, another subtle nod to him retracing old paths. If we zoom out and look at Pengacara Papan Atas in the context of Indonesian cinema, it feels like a natural evolution from earlier social dramas that tackled issues like corruption, domestic abuse, and class inequality but often kept the legal system as a shadowy off-screen presence. Here, the courtroom is front and center, but the story never becomes a procedural in the dry sense. It stays anchored in emotion and moral conflict, which is likely why it connected so strongly with a broad audience. In my mind, I can already see the kinds of conversations people will have after watching. Law students arguing about whether they could, in good conscience, defend someone they believe is guilty, survivors debating whether the film feels validating or re-traumatizing, older viewers comparing the case in the film to real-world scandals that were swept under the rug during previous administrations. At film festivals, especially if this plays at something like Busan or Toronto, international critics will probably latch onto its universality, praising its slow-burn intensity and grounded performances, while also maybe critiquing it for occasionally spelling out its themes too explicitly in dialogue. Awards bodies, both local and regional, love morally weighty fare with topical relevance, so I wouldn't be surprised if it racked up nominations for Best Picture, Best Actor, Best Actress in a Supporting Role for the actress playing Kinaya or Lila, and definitely Best Screenplay, because even with its occasional didactic lines, the script juggles a lot of characters and subplots with impressive clarity. Audience reaction within Indonesia would likely be more split along generational and class lines. Younger viewers might embrace it as a rare mainstream film that speaks to their anger about entrenched power, while some members of the legal elite might dismiss it as unrealistic or unfairly critical of defense lawyers. You can almost picture pundits on TV saying things like, "We must remember that everyone is entitled to a defense," using that truism as a shield against deeper questions about what it means when those defenses are deployed asymmetrically in favor of the already powerful. But art isn't meant to make the comfortable feel safe, it's meant to provoke, and on that front, Pengacara Papan Atas succeeds. Something else that really hit me, on a second viewing in my head, is how the film uses the unborn child as a kind of silent moral barometer. Kinaya's pregnancy isn't just a plot device to raise the stakes in the restaurant scene, it's a recurring presence that reorients the conversations Haro and Kinaya have about justice and risk. When they consider going public with what they witnessed, the camera will often drift down to her belly, not in a mawkish, saccharine way, but as a quiet reminder that their choices aren't just about the present, they are about the kind of world their kid is going to grow up in. There's a scene late in the film where they're assembling a crib, and the TV in the background is replaying a clip of Zessen delivering a particularly cutting line of cross-examination that undermines part of Lila's testimony. Harrow pauses, hammer in hand, and says, "If one day our child asks us what we did when things like this were happening, what do we say? That we turned off the TV," and Kinaya, exhausted, replies, "Maybe we say we chose to keep you safe first, and then, when we could, we tried to do more." That line, "when we could, we tried to do more," is so important, because it doesn't let them off the hook, but it also acknowledges reality. Not everyone is in a position to protest, testify, or risk their livelihood, and I think the film is careful to avoid purity tests. It doesn't say you're either a full-time activist or you're complicit scum. Instead, it suggests that everyone has a threshold, a zone where they can safely act, and that maybe the challenge is constantly pushing that zone outward, bit by bit, without burning yourself or your loved ones alive in the process. Zessen's version of that is more extreme, obviously. His zone of action involves leveraging enormous institutional power, and that's why his small course corrections, refusing to take certain clients, quietly strengthening the prosecution's hand with his choices in court, matter so much more. Yet the film also quietly points out that individual conscience, while essential, is not enough in the face of entrenched systems. One of the most sobering sequences comes when we learn about the plea bargains being discussed behind closed doors. There's a chance, we're told, that Senzu could plead to a lesser charge, serve a drastically reduced sentence, and avoid the sex offender registry altogether, in exchange for sparing the victim further trauma on the stand. The prosecution team is split. Some argue that securing any admission of guilt is a win in a system that rarely even acknowledges survivors' stories. Others feel it's a betrayal of the gravity of what happened. Zessen is present in some of those discussions, but notably, not central. He's one actor among many. The ultimate decision hinges not on his crisis of conscience but on a complex calculus of institutional incentives, public pressure, and the victim's own capacity for endurance. In that way, the film resists the temptation to make him the sole hero or villain. It keeps reminding us that while individuals matter, structures matter more, and without structural reform, better laws, better training for judges and lawyers on trauma, better protections for victims, we will just keep replaying variations of this story, with different faces but the same sickening pattern. That might sound depressing, but the film also seeds hope in small, tangible ways. The NGO scenes, the survivor support circle, the law students debating ethics, the young prosecutor holding her ground, these are all glimpses of a generation and a civil society that aren't content to accept, that's just how it is. And I think that's why the movie resonates beyond just being dark or heavy. It doesn't wallow in despair, it acknowledges it and then moves through it, towards something more complex, a fragile, stubborn insistence that better is possible, even if it's painfully slow. On the level of dialogue, there are lines that will probably stick with viewers and get quoted a lot, like the moment in court when Zessen, after a long, brutal day of testimony, looks at the judge and says, "The law does not feel. It does not bleed. We do." That is both its strength and its greatest weakness, and you can read that line a couple of ways. On one hand, it's him trying to position himself as a neutral operator of a cold system, almost defending his role. On the other, it's a veiled admission that this dispassionate facade is exactly what allows him to do harm. Another line, from Lila, is even more piercing. When asked by the prosecutor why she decided to go public instead of keeping the matter within a private settlement, she says, "Because silence is a luxury I cannot afford. Silence is for people whose lives won't be ruined by whispers. Mine already is." It's not delivered as some triumphant slogan. She says it with a shaky voice, clearly terrified, but there's a steel underneath that stays with you. And there's a quieter exchange, one that might not be as quotable but hit me just as hard. Kinaya, talking to another survivor at the support group, says, "I thought if I left journalism I'd be leaving all this behind. But it finds you, even when you're just trying to eat dinner," and the other woman nods and replies, "We don't get to choose the stories we live, only the ones we tell about them." And that tiny conversation does more than pages of exposition to tie together the film's threads about narrative, media, and lived experience. In terms of craft, the score's restraint, which I mentioned earlier, is also a huge part of why these moments land. There's a welcome lack of manipulative swells in the most emotional scenes. Instead, music often enters in unexpected places, like during transition shots of Jakarta at night, or while we're watching seemingly mundane things. cleaning staff tidying the empty courtroom, protesters packing up their banners after a long day, Haro riding home on a crowded bus, staring at the floor. The composer seems more interested in scoring the spaces between the big events than the events themselves, which subtly shifts our focus from what happened to what it feels like to live with what happened, and that, in turn, aligns beautifully with the film's thematic focus on aftermath and endurance. If you're the kind of viewer who pays attention to performance subtleties, Pengacara Papan is full of little grace notes that reward you. Watch the way Zesan's posture changes depending on who he's with, in front of Dano and other elites. He's upright, contained, almost regal. With his staff, he allows a bit of looseness, a glimpse of exasperation or dark humor. With his mother, he shrinks just a little, turns his face away more, as if bracing for disappointment. With Lila on the stand, he oscillates between direct eye contact and fleeing gaze, like a man wrestling with two incompatible selves in real time. Tsunzu, for all his bluster, has tiny tells too. He compulsively checks his reflection in surfaces, phone screens, windows, even the polished wood of the defense table, as if constantly needing to reassure himself he still looks like the golden boy he's always been told he is. Dano has this habit of smoothing his tie whenever things get morally uncomfortable, a small attempt to straighten an image that's increasingly out of sync with reality. Even minor characters get their moments, the court clerk whose eyes flick toward the public gallery when something shocking is said, the older female judge's slight eyebrow lift when a particularly misogynistic argument is made, telling you volumes about what she thinks even if she's bound to procedural neutrality. All of this creates a sense that you're watching real people, not archetypes, inhabit this story. If we talk about pacing and structure from a scriptwriting point of view, the film follows a kind of three-act spine but allows plenty of digressions. The first act sets up the players and the inciting incidents, the assignment of the case to Zesan, the restaurant harassment, the viral video, and plants the seeds of Zesan's past connection to Tsunzu without revealing it fully. The second act is where the trial grinds on, alliances shift, and moral pressure mounts, culminating in that midpoint-like jolt of Tsunzu recognizing Zesan and the flood of contextual flashbacks for the audience. The third act, instead of building toward a single explosive climax, splinters into multiple smaller climaxes, the verdict, the NGO support circle, Haro and Kinaya's decision about their involvement, Zesan's subtle acts of rebellion within the system, and finally, his quiet shift into a different kind of practice. It's a less conventional shape for a thriller, but it mirrors the truth that in real life, there isn't one moment where everything changes, there are multiple, scattered inflection points where people make choices and then live with the ripples. One could argue that this structure might dilute tension for some viewers craving that one big showdown, but for me, it felt more honest and, in a way, more unsettling, because it denies you that neat sense of resolution that a big climactic scene usually provides. Thematically, I also found it interesting how the film interrogates the idea of winning. For Tsunzu, winning means walking free, reputation intact enough to eventually rebuild his life. For Dano, winning means keeping the family name out of the mud, maintaining business relationships, limiting financial damage. For the prosecution, winning means a conviction that will be upheld on appeal, a precedent that might make similar cases easier to prosecute in the future. For Lila, winning at first seems like it would mean seeing her rapist behind bars, but as the film progresses, you can see that what she really wants is something more intangible, to be believed, to reclaim some sense of agency, to have her suffering acknowledged as real and unjust. For Zesan, winning has always meant one thing, a verdict in favor of his client, but Pengacara Papan systematically deconstructs that simplistic equation. By the end, you get the sense that he's no longer sure what a win even looks like. If he successfully secures an acquittal for Tsunzu, is that victory or complicity? If he fails, but in failing protects Lila from further harm on the stand, is that defeat or a different kind of success? The film doesn't tie these questions up in a bow. It lets them hang, trusting the audience to wrestle with them, and I think that is part of why people will still be arguing about this movie long after the buzz dies down. From a purely visceral angle, there are individual scenes that are going to sear themselves into people's memories. The restaurant confrontation, the first playing of Lila's video, the silent ride home where Haro grips the steering wheel so tight his knuckles whiten while Kinaya stares straight ahead, tears spilling but voice steady as she says, "Next time I see a man like that, I'm walking out, with or without my food." the hushed support group where someone cracks a dark joke and the room erupts into that particular kind of laughter that's actually a release valve for shared pain. The moment in court when the judge asks Lila if she wants a break and she says, "If I leave the stand, I might not come back," and you can see the respect in the judge's eyes even if her official face stays neutral. These are the micro-dramas the film builds itself from, more than twists or stunts. And even the smaller tech choices, like the color grading shifting subtly to cooler tones in scenes where institutional power is most present, or the sound of camera shutters clicking like gunfire every time a key figure enters or leaves the courtroom, reinforce the sense that this story is about how systems bear down on individuals. Ultimately, though, what makes Pengacara Papan utter stick is not just its craft or its topicality, but the human questions it leaves you chewing on. If you have a talent that the powerful can exploit, what responsibility do you have to resist that pull? Is it enough to be less harmful within a bad system, or must you eventually confront and try to change that system head-on? When someone like Tsunzu finally faces consequences, however partial or delayed, does that actually signal progress, or is it just a high-profile exception that leaves the underlying dynamics untouched? When we, as viewers, consume stories of assault and justice, are we contributing to change by paying attention and talking about them, or are we at risk of turning other people's trauma into just another narrative thrill? The film doesn't wag its finger at you with answers, it just keeps circling those questions, like the camera circling Zessen in his office at dawn, keeping you uncomfortably aware that you're implicated, not in some accusatory way, but in the sense that all of us, to varying degrees, uphold or challenge the cultures we live in. And that, I think, is why this movie feels so right for a deep dive review like this. It's not the kind of thing you watch and then just rate out of 10 and move on, it's the